One of my earliest memories growing up is of long family road trips listening to the 1988 symphonic recording of Les Miserables. I remember being fascinated as my mom told me the story behind the songs being sung. I quickly fell in love with the story of the play, though I've since become less enchanted with the love story between Marius and Cosette now that I think about it, and the characters behind the voices of Colm Wilkinson and Philip Quast. Later on, I found myself reading the original novel by Victor Hugo, an unabridged version, by the way, really long, and found myself enjoying the story of the book as much as the musical, and I was impressed with how faithful the musical was to the book. Obviously, certain parts and characters were removed, but the core story was largely untouched, and the book served to enrich my love for these characters. But one thing I found myself enjoying more about the musical than the book was the ending. The book ends with Jean Valjean being buried in a nameless grave with a line describing how his life had been odd and ultimately ended when he had nothing left to live for after he lost Cosette. It's a very bleak ending, which works for a novel about many bleak existences, but I found myself enjoying the musical's ending more, which ends with an epilogue in which Valjean joins the spirits of Fantine and Eponine and those who died at the barricade, singing of hope for a better life, if not in this world, then the world after. Call me an optimist, but I like that ending better. Fast forward to 2012, and Les Miserables was adapted to film, and it was decent. I enjoyed the camera work and the attempts to make it feel more like a film than a play, as well as the attempts to merge events from the book with the narrative of the musical. But there was one thing that I found bothered me about the film. Well, a couple things, but the big one was that during the epilogue, I couldn't help but feel that someone was missing, and then it hit me. Where's Javert? Now, some may be thinking, Javert, he was the bad guy. Why should he get to join all those good people in the afterlife? While the more scholarly among you are probably thinking, oh boy, here we go, another essay about how Valjean and Javert are two sides of the same coin, as if that topic hasn't been talked to death. And my goal here is to prove both thoughts wrong. When you really look at Javert's actions, morals, and life in general, you realize that he's not quite so evil as you may believe. And while I'm fully aware of how easy it is to compare the two adversaries, they even draw from the same real-life criminal turned policeman, I intend to simply look at Javert based on his own merits and his own actions. Also, just a heads up, I'll be drawing from both the novel and the musical, since, as I said, neither takes anything from the other, they just complement one another very well. So, as Javert says in The Confrontation, Javert was born inside a jail to a gypsy and a galley slave. And this is where I want to make one quick comparison to Jean Valjean. This is the only one, I promise. Valjean frequently states that he stole a loaf of bread to help his sister's family, and that he is a victim of circumstance, and this is a fair assessment, especially given the time of the novel, although Valjean himself also admits he probably could have begged for the bread and it probably would have been given to him out of compassion. Honestly, he probably actually caused more inconvenience to the baker by breaking his window than stealing the bread. But argument could be made that Javert is even more so a victim of circumstance. Early on, Javert realized that the society he lived in would exclude two types of men, criminals and law enforcement, which means, having been born in prison, he was essentially born in exile. Circumstances don't get much more out of your control than circumstances of birth. And the easy way, the path of least resistance, probably would have been for Javert to turn to crime. But he chose not to. Instead, he chose to serve the law and essentially made the law his religion. He chose the high ground, hoping to find salvation in service and protection of society. As a police officer, Javert is devoted to the law, with the book stating that he would have arrested his own father if he escaped from prison and turned in his own mother for breaking parole, and he would have done it with that sort of interior satisfaction that springs from virtue. Brutal, but it means that he put his own beliefs before any sort of familial bonds. But not out of any kind of resentment or anger, but just out of a genuine belief that he was doing the right thing. In the song Stars, Javert expresses his adoration for the lights in the sky, stating, "You are the sentinels, silent and sure, keeping watch in the night." I don't think this is just his adoration for the lights in the sky. It's how Javert wishes to be himself. As he tells Jean Valjean, I am from the gutter too. He has experienced the darkness and evil of the world and wants to be a light in that darkness. And he sees that darkness in Jean Valjean the first time they meet. Now keep in mind, Valjean wasn't always the kind orphan-adopting philanthropist we come to know, love, and mourn. When Javert first meets him, Victor Hugo describes him as essentially a vicious man filled with nothing but hatred for society, humanity, and creation as a whole, and who intends to do harm to anyone and anything that crosses his path. It's only because of the Bishop of D that he becomes the good man that we know. That is the man Javert met at the beginning, and the kind of man he sought to protect his fellow men from. And while Javert's fanatical service to law enforcement would at times blind him both in his dealings with Valjean and Fantine, he was only doing what he believed to be right, like many other people in this play. Take another look at the mobs who led the June Rebellion. They are portrayed quite romantically in Victor Hugo's novel, but consider what they're actually revolting against. Because of Louis Philippe and the death of General Jean Lamarque. Now, they describe Lamarque as a champion of the common folk, but while that made him popular with commoners, in the words of Hugo, he was loved by the mob because he served the emperor well, that emperor being Napoleon Bonaparte. And while Hugo still expressed his admiration for the June Rebellion and the disparity of wealth in France would eventually result in Louis Philippe's abdication, Hugo essentially acknowledges that Louis Philippe was a good man. Unfortunately, he was also a king. So this play is full of people doing what they believe to be the right thing, some trying to get the government's attention, and men like Javert just trying to keep the peace. But then Javert is forced to confront whether or not he's actually been the servant to society that he's been trying to be. Jean Valjean is given the chance to kill Javert and refuses. And Jean Valjean leaves Javert with the following words: "There is nothing that I blame you for. You've done your duty, nothing more." Which can be seen as both a commendation and a condemnation. Javert has only ever done his duty and has never overstepped his authority, but he's never gone beyond it either. And this realization that someone like Jean Valjean can change shakes Javert to his very core. He's forced to question whether or not he's truly been serving society, and that his path to salvation may have actually led him to hell. And unable to find anywhere to turn, Javert chooses to take his own life. But in the novel, before taking the final leap, Javert writes a letter to the prefect. In it, he details ways that the justice system in Paris is flawed, and ways they can better serve the people and the prisoners they capture. This is a man who has given up on life and accepted that his way of serving justice was wrong, but he's still trying to make the world a better place. And that's ultimately what makes Javert a great man. He's never done anything for himself. It's always been to help society grow and survive. True, it's been through harsh and sometimes questionable justice, but it's always been for the benefit of society as a whole. And it was either that or succumb to the temptations of a life of crime. Ultimately, his fatal flaw was in a failure to understand the concept of mercy and the ways it can coincide with justice. But doesn't excluding him from the epilogue kind of prove him right? In the epilogue of the musical, the following words are sung. "Do you hear the people sing, lost in the valley of the night? It is the music of a people who are climbing to the light. For the wretched of the earth, there is a flame that never dies. Even the darkest night will end, and the sun will rise. They will live again in freedom in the garden of the Lord. We will walk behind the plowshare. We will put away the sword. The chain will be broken, and all men will have their reward." Les Miserables is about these people lost in one of the darkest times in France's history, seeking a light to get them through the darkness of the times. Javert tried to be that light while also seeking it out himself. Javert, as much as any other member of this story, deserves to put away his sword and receive his reward. And what greater reward could he receive than to be proven wrong? I'm Tides of Glory. Sorry for the long wait. Thanks for watching.